You know, it's a pleasure to have Gregg Jarrett on the program. Why? Because he's smart. He's a good lawyer. He understands tyranny when he sees it. He's not afraid to stand up to it. How are you, my friend?
Hey, I'm well. Thank you. It's good to be with you, Mark.
It's a pleasure. Well, you've written a hell of a book here, The Trial of the Century. What is the trial of the century? Which one?
You know, there have been a lot of famous trials that have been dubbed as such by the media over the years. The Nuremberg case, Julius Ethel Rosenberg, the O.J. Simpson double murder case, which I covered for 9 months in Los Angeles. They pale in comparison to the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, because at stake was our cherished free speech rights. America was at the precipice. There was an effort, and it was succeeding, to ban books, for example, on evolution, and they weren't going to stop there. They were going to ban a variety of science books and other books. And in the state of Tennessee, they made it a crime for a teacher to teach out of the state-approved textbooks a chapter on the cornerstone Darwin theory of evolution, because they feared it would undermine the story of the divine creation in Genesis in the Bible, which it didn't. They're harmonious. And Clarence Darrow was incensed over it. So when a young 25-year-old school teacher was handcuffed, criminally charged, and thrown in the hoosgow, Darrow came to the rescue, the greatest trial lawyer who ever lived, and he, for free, defended John Scopes. It became known as the Scopes monkey trial, which was derived from an evolutionary misconception that humans evolved from monkeys or other primates. I traveled a couple of years ago to the courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee, where the trial took place. It's closed now, but buried in the archives of the basement, and I gained access, was the original trial transcript on which the trial of the century is based. It tells the story about how the courage of a young school teacher and his great acclaimed lawyer, Clarence Darrow, changed the tide in America that was on the precipice. And, but for their efforts, America might be a very different place today, Mark.
Are you getting any people say, oh, it's just like DeSantis in Florida, which, of course, it's not?
No, nobody's made that accusation
Get ready for
as
it.
yet. I am ready for it. The book just came out today in bookstores nationwide. People can order it online. It did get some good reviews, from Publishers Weekly.
That's good.
They said it was colorful and dramatic and tells an important story. Kirkus gave it a starred review, which for somebody like me working at Fox News is unheard of. Although you may have gotten one for your excellence.
Who the hell knows?
I don't recall.
Let me ask you this. You take this almost step by step, the major elements of this trial and so forth. And it is intriguing. And you say you got this transcript. Did you get a transcript of the whole trial, or did you have to just go back to the books and break it down and take a look at all of this?
I got a complete transcript, the original transcript of the trial. It was printed out every day, and it was published at the time in 1925 in newspapers around the country and throughout the world, and people were following it. It was then put together in one volume, and I got my hands on that, as well as the handwritten long-form notes of the judge's court reporter, note-taking throughout the trial. And I used all of that, studied it for months and months. I wrote all the chapters on the trial. My co-author, Don Yeager, did a lot of the background digging into the history of the town and the characters involved. We put it all together, and, most Americans, because you know history and the law, but most Americans have never heard of the trial of the century.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And that's the date of my father's birth, 1925. And so what happened? There's this big trial. Tell the people what the jury did. Tell the people what happened after the trial.
Well, Darrow realized that he was facing overwhelming odds, and he was standing alone to take on popular opinion. You know, banning books on evolution and criminalizing the teaching of it was quite popular across America. A bunch of states passed these laws. So there he is, you know, not in home field advantage. The courtroom was packed with supporters of the great fundamentalist leader William Jennings Bryan, who was so happy that he got the law passed, he volunteered to be the prosecutor to convict Scopes. And the jury was composed of devoted church members. I don't begrudge that at all. I go to church. I'm very devout. Only one of them knew anything about evolution. 3 had read no other book except the Bible. The presiding judge was an ordained minister. He'd been critical of evolution, and his rulings from the bench consistently favored the prosecution. At one point, when Darrow raised questions of fairness, he was held in criminal contempt of court. And the judge prevented Darrow from putting on a legitimate defense of his choosing. He had assembled at great expense a team of nationally renowned scientists and theologians to explain to the jury how evolution does not undermine the Bible. But the judge would have none of it, refused to allow any of them to testify before the jury, and Darrow then did something extraordinary. It was daring. It was consequential. He called the prosecutor, his nemesis, William Jennings Bryan, to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible, knowing that Bryan's ego would never allow him to resist. Sure enough, Bryan took the bait. He stood up and insisted he would testify.
Hold your point. Hold your point. We're going to take a hard break. And by the way, you feel like you're there when you read your book. You feel like you're right there in the courtroom. It's a fantastic book, ladies and gentlemen. You can get it at Amazon.com. It came out just today. The Trial of the Century by Gregg Jarrett. It's well worth reading. The Scopes Monkey Trial, 1925. Trial of the Century, that's the book. Gregg Jarrett, you know him from Fox. He's a terrific lawyer. And you know what's good about you, Greg, is you take your time. You walk people through so they understand complex issues. You do exactly that with this book. It is absolutely fascinating. And folks, if you're not clear on what happened in this trial, even though you're hearing Greg and me talk about it, you really need to read it. And you can get it at Amazon.com, any of my social sites, The Trial of the Century, Gregg Jarrett. All right. So tell us about this confrontation. There it is, the big confrontation.
The climactic moment of the trial, Darrow appears to have lost because the deck is stacked against him. He's in the lion's den, if you will. And he calls the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, the epic, legendary fundamentalist leader, to the witness stand. And the judge was fearful the second-room courtroom might collapse. So he moves it outdoors to a platform left over from July 4th festivities. So there they are, Darrow, face to face. I've got a photograph in the book, 38 photographs, but one of them is Darrow face to face with Bryan. And he challenges Bryan's interpretation that everything in the Bible should be accepted literally as written. And of course we know, and theologians know, and even the Pope knows, that there are passages in the Bible that are parables. They're allegory. They teach us important moral lessons, but they're spiritual, not literal. So thousands of people are looking on. You can see the picture of it. Darrow's cross-examination was bold. It was mesmerizing. He dismantled the veneer of Bryan's strident beliefs. And, you know, the more Bryan fumbled trying to answer these tough questions, the more sentiment in the crowd that loved Bryan began to shift. Derisive laughter from the crowd that only inflamed Bryan's panic. And he destroyed his nemesis. He was thoroughly discredited. Bryan had clung to a righteousness that he mistakenly ascribed to virtue, and he tried to force his religious ideology on others by enacting this misbegotten law. And he was so broken that he laid down for a nap a couple of days later, still in Dayton, just down the street from the courthouse, and he never woke up. He died. And I've got a picture of his casket, flag drape, being loaded onto a Pullman car, being taken up to Washington, D.C., people lining the tracks to pay their respects for this great man. And he was a great man, and I admired him. His Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention in 1896, one of the greatest speeches ever delivered. But it was a sad epitaph for a once great man, that he clung without compromise to something that, theologians and all major religions now concede exists. Evolution presupposes creationism. That's what Pope Francis said. They're not in conflict, they're harmonious. And so Darrow lost the trial, but historians would write that he won it. And, Mark, why did he win it? Because he shifted public opinion. It spelled the beginning of the end for the banning of books. It stood up for the importance of freedom of speech, academic autonomy, intellectual empowerment. It stood for the indispensable proposition that no one should be told how to think. And that is the bottom line from the trial of the century.
Now, what do you say to listeners out there who believe that the Bible is, in fact, the Word, and yet you say that evolution and the Bible are not in conflict? It's a good point.
Yeah, and Darrow's point, and I'm paraphrasing here, in his argument before the judge and jury, is just as people should be allowed to exercise their religion freely, people ought to be able to learn freely. Let them make up their own minds. Science and mathematics and history should not be subject to a litmus test of the Bible. The Bible cannot and should not be a yardstick for all learning in the world. And that was really the point here. Let people decide for themselves, but don't foreclose their ability to learn. Evolution, whether you believe it or not, is a cornerstone, sort of fundamental element of science. And as I say, 98% of theologians agree with Darrow's argument, and indeed the Pope did. He built on the works of previous popes, Pius XII and John Paul II. And so, Darrow always sought common ground. And I think we today in society can also seek common ground. The Pope said evolution of nature does not contrast with the notion of creation.
All right, my friend. That's Gregg Jarrett. The book is The Trial of the Century. I know you're going to find it fantastic, absolutely compelling. Now, one last question. Why did you choose this case? I know you think it's the trial of the century, and I think you're probably right, but out of all the things you could write on, why this?
Well, I was a teenager when I discovered Clarence Darrow and the trial of the century. My father had volumes of books on his densely packed bookshelf, and, one summer day, I don't know why I did it, and I explained this in the preface. I plucked that book from the shelf, and I sat down, and I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. I loved books, always have. The more I read it, the more I admired Darrow's passion for the law, his sense of justice, his unyielding commitment to civil liberties and intellectual freedom. And by the time I had finished it, it changed my life. It shaped the contours of the remainder of my life. It inspired me to pursue a legal career. And at the end of this book by the great writer Irving Stone, 1941, he tells the story of the trial of the century, but it's a short chapter. It deserved more. And for the last 55 years, I've wanted to write this book, and I finally did.
Mm-hmm. And did a fantastic job. Folks, I encourage you to go to Amazon.com right now. Get a copy of this book. It'll be on your steps tomorrow. That's The Trial of the Century, talking to Gregg Jarrett. Or any major bookstore should have it as well. But you can get it on Amazon immediately. The Trial of the Century, Amazon.com. We've also linked to it on all of my social sites. Gregg, I hope to see you one day soon, my friend.
I do, too. I miss seeing you. And listen, thank you very much for having me on. You've been very kind in your comments about my book. And I do hope people will take the time to read it.
I think they will. Take care of yourself. God bless.
Thank you. You too.